A few months ago, I made a video about one of my favorite things to make, gumbo. It was a pretty good video and it did pretty well. It also allowed me to jump into a part of my life I don't share on this channel, my love for the culinary arts. I'm a home cook and I enjoy cooking all the time. Gumbo is something I've worked on for a very long time, but to be frank, it's an undertaking. No one, except restaurants perhaps, is making gumbo once a week. It's labor intensive and it can be pricey depending on what you put in it. So, here we are at yet another cooking video and I'm at a crossroads. Do I make another video about a food that you probably wouldn't make but once every quarter, or do I give you something much easier and probably right up most people's alley? I'll try the second option. If you haven't watched the first video in this impromptu series, I'm from Louisiana. This place is Cajun, French, and a whole bunch of other shit. While there is a lot of convergence in the culture, there is a huge love for tradition. It's so ingrained in our culture that many families have certain foods that are ubiquitous in thousands of kitchens around the city of New Orleans and beyond. You hear the classics often: jambalaya, gumbo, crawfish etouffee, and so on. However, there are a lot of unique circumstances with many of these dishes, and some are labors of love, and others are just really pains in the ass. In short, you aren't eating these things on a weekly basis. Well, jambalaya maybe, but that's another video. One thing that's a constant about food culture, however, is this. Every dish was once a humble offering on the table of the everyman. It may be elevated by a fancy restaurant nowadays or go viral for clout and fame, but its roots are always somewhere on the hardworking family's table or a small hole in the wall. It is here we will take a look at one of the easiest comfort foods to make on a Monday: red beans and rice. Alright, so walk with me. We're gonna walk this back just a little bit. Red beans and rice is a Louisiana tradition that dates back for who knows how long. On Monday, it's cleaning day. You have a lot to do, don't you? Wash the clothing, strip the bedding, dust the rafters, shake the cat for puking on the rug for the third time this morning, and clean the bathrooms and chamber pots. Yeah, a couple centuries ago were something different. Anyway, if you were a maid or the one cleaning the house, cooking would be the last thing on your mind. Man, if only there was something I could cook all day and have ready all by the time I'm done with all my chores. It could be healthy, reasonably, affordable, and be loaded with way too many pork products to count. Enter red beans and rice. Red beans and rice was a dish one could begin at the start of the day and let it cook all day. You put everything into a pot of water, beans, vegetables, and meat, and let it all coalesce into a finished product that was savory and creamy. The sausages and the seasonings would perfectly spice the beans, and the long cook time ensured that the beans broke down and produced something that stuck to the ribs. Most often, it will be served with fried chicken as a side item. But today, let's focus on the Monday classic, red beans and rice. To start, let's talk about a few things. This is basically a stew full of beans, so you'll need a few parts: the beans, the cooking liquid, and the flavoring agents. While you can use any bean to create this particular recipe, I'll be using red, or kidney beans. Kidney beans require a long cooking time at a relatively steady temperature of around 212 degrees Fahrenheit. If you don't, the beans can make you sick due to a protein called kidney bean lectin that can make you very ill. Don't worry though, this recipe will cook this compound out far before you're ready to eat these beans. The cooking liquid can indeed just be water, but I have a whole part of a video dedicated to making chicken stock from scratch, so maybe you can take a look at that video and come back to me if you want to give it a try. I myself am going to be lazy and use boxed chicken stock this time. This is a lazy recipe after all, so don't be me if you don't want to. We're all scraping by these days. Anyway, lastly, the flavoring agents are all to preference. I'll be making these beans based on what I grew up eating, but consider making the dish vegetarian by opting for more vegetables instead of meat, and among other twists and tweaks. Now, let's begin. If you're using a bag or bags of dried beans like me, you'll begin by opening said bag and dumping the beans into a bowl. Grab another empty bowl, or preferably a strainer, and begin sorting your beans from the full vessel to the empty one. You're looking for beans that are cracked, broken, have holes, or are actually just rocks, which happens way more than you think it does. Take your time and sort them all out, being sure to keep an eye out for foreign material and bad looking beans in general. Eventually, you'll have all your beans sifted through and ready for the next step. Take these beans, freshly sorted, and give them a quick rinse in the sink. Once you've sufficiently rinsed them, we'll take these beans and put them into a large pot. Cover them with at least double the amount of water they need to be covered with and let them sit for at least 5 hours, or preferably overnight. By the way, this isn't mandatory. You can in fact cook these beans right after rinsing them, though they'll take longer to cook. They'll be cooking for a while anyway, but I like how much faster the beans break down and get to the last stage of cooking for a much longer amount of time. Anyway, when you return to your beans, in my case the next morning, the beans will have absorbed quite a bit of liquid and would have gotten plump from their stint in the water. Take a colander or strainer and strain these beans out. We'll let them strain for a while and tend to our other ingredients. For vegetables, you might be familiar with this term, Trinity. We'll be using the same accoutrement as gumbo here: onion, celery, and bell pepper, along with garlic. As red beans and rice is an easy and low labor food, I'm being lazy myself again and have a pre-cut mix of Trinity, something that is readily available where I'm from. If you don't have something like this though, you just use 1 onion, 1 green bell pepper, and 3 or 4 ribs of celery. Dice this up and set that aside. We'll also add a couple of cloves of garlic. I have fresh garlic today and I'll be mincing up around 8 cloves before I set it all aside. Finally, we're going to contend with the meats. Like gumbo, we'll be using 2 different types of meat in our beans today. I have here 2 different types of sausage, again, just like my gumbo video, and I'll be slicing these into half moons, nice and thin. See? A half moon. This one doesn't look like a half moon, more like I don't know what the hell this is. I'm using roughly 1.5 pounds of about 1/2 kilogram of this stuff. Set that aside and contend with the next piece of meat, which we'll need to treat differently from the sausage. Our second piece of meat will be this little devil here, salted pork or pickled pork. This is where a lot of the salt will be coming from. I'm using 1 pound of beans, so I have 1 piece of pickled pork. Given its extremely high salt content and its tendency to get really tough when cooked, you'll want to take this lump of meat and put it into a small pot of water. Bring this pot up to a boil before turning the heat to low and letting this cook for 20 minutes. My mother, who helped me R&D this recipe, was very adamant to cook the pork for exactly 20 minutes. If you don't, she said the world would end or some shit. So, listening to her sage advice, I'm cooking for around 21 minutes because all children will defy their parents at some point. See? And nothing bad happened. Once the pork is cooked, pull it out of the pot and set it aside to cool. The only other ingredients you'll need are 3 to 4 bay leaves, salt, pepper, season the salt, and the optional dried thyme, dried oregano, onion, and garlic powder. With everyone in place, we can finally begin to get cooking. In a large pot you trust, set the heat to medium, and once it starts to show off some heat, toss in your sausage. Let the sausage brown and caramelize a bit, letting it get crispy and a bit curly on the edges. If you don't want all this excess grease, you can broil the sausage in the oven and pat it dry once it's browned and crisped. Or you can just skip this step, some people do that too. If you're browning the sausage in a pot, remove the meat after it's crisped slightly and set it to drain on a paper towel. You'll be left with a sheen of rendered sausage grease all at the bottom of the pot. If you're okay with it, you can use this fat to continue cooking. Otherwise, use whatever oil you fancy and drizzle it down into the pot, returning the heat to medium. Once the pot is showing off some heat, add the onion, bell pepper, and celery into the pot. Cook this for around 3 to 5 minutes before adding the garlic and cooking until the garlic becomes fragrant, around 1 minute. Finally, we're ready to put the liquid in this pot. Follow your package of beans directions in regards to its liquid content. For me, I'm using 8 cups of liquid per pound of beans, so I'll use 4 cups of unsalted chicken stock and 4 cups of water. Add the beans into the pot again, add the sausage into the pot, and finally cut the pickled pork into manageable pieces and slip it into the pot as well. Turn the heat to high and wait for the pot to boil before finally setting the heat down to low and beginning the cooking process from anywhere around 2 to 5 hours. As this cooks on a simmer, the beans will begin to break down and slowly lose their constitution. The longer you cook everything, the more the flavor will mellow out and mix. Don't forget to taste as you go, adding salt and other seasonings as necessary. I used very little salt, only adding garlic powder somewhere in the latter half of the cooking process. The beans should slowly begin to break down and the liquid inside the pot should begin to thicken. After about 3 hours, the beans should be at the point where they're just turning nice and soft but still hold some of their structure. After around 4 hours, the beans would have softened further and begin to break down. And after 5, you'll see the beans enter this state of creaminess where the beans have left their skin and begun to merge with the cooking liquid. Lastly, I'm adding a pat of butter to the beans at the very end. Not a whole lot, but you're going to put just a tiny bit in, along with some scallion. The heat goes off at this point to preserve the green onion's color, and I'm giving it all a mix to incorporate the butter. It gives it one final push for a cohesive creaminess that these beans need to go over the finish line. Towards the last hour of cooking, you can prepare your rice and any other sides you'll be having. I'm using jasmine rice today, so I'll make a batch of this stuff, washing it all thoroughly before salting and putting it into a rice cooker. Please wash your rice. Please wash your rice. Finally, I'm going to be making fried chicken. Now, this is where I messed up. I seasoned everything, the chicken itself and the flour. However, my oil wasn't fresh and it came out quite dark. Failure in my book, but hey, it still came out pretty good. Once all of our items are nice and cooked, we're ready to plate. Grab a spoonful of rice, or however much you want really, ball out, then ladle out your beans over the bed of rice. Plate up your side order and dig in. After about 5 hours of slow cooking, the beans are exactly like how I remember them in my childhood. Smooth and creamy with bits of smoked sausage and tender pieces of pork in every bite. The herbs and the vegetables inside are mellow and soft, pulling you through the notes of spice and just the right amount of smokiness and salt. I didn't have any, but if you have some chopped parsley on top would tie everything together even better. This whole thing is something that lasts in the fridge almost as long as gumbo. However, I find this is far easier to make and can be frozen for later dates. It can also be scaled up pretty easily, you just change the amount of beans and meat that goes inside. The chicken was good as well, though a bit bitter due to the oil I had being a bit old, but you do what you can, am I right? I fudged this one, so if you get to this video to maybe like 50 likes, I'll make a video just about fried chicken and try to redeem myself. One more thing I wanted to touch on real quick. I filmed a quick segment of the beans the next day. The beans have fully creamed over, leaving them even more silky and luscious. I like them best like this, but they'll always be a simple and effective way to fill your stomach, and it's also healthy too. As long as you don't stuff it with sausages, I suppose. And that's it. This recipe is a staple where I come from. Everyone has their little tricks and specialties, but this is how I make my own. If you make this recipe, let me know in the comments on what you thought. Oh, I should mention, the same ingredients can be used for other beans. Pinto, white, black, navy, you get the idea. If you want this to be vegetarian, you could just sieve the sausage and meat and add vegetable stock and water or whatever else you want to add. This is a very modular dish, so as long as you have the time, you can make something really great. With that said, I'm heading out again. I have to research my next video, and until then, take care of yourself and don't forget to eat well. If not for me, for yourself at least. I'll see you dogs later.